Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're just going to keep letting people in as they come, but want to get started here. Thank you for joining us today on our third session of our cross-border perspective series. To start, as always, I would like to acknowledge the land that we're on, where I am and where WEOC's head office is on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, Dakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation, and that we source our water from the Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. Thank you so much for joining us today. Like I said, this is the third of our sessions, and we will be recording, and we're recording right now, and have this session up in our library. We will also be creating resources based on this session in English, French, and Spanish, and we'll be distributing them to everyone who registered today. And we'll also have that up on our online library to share in the coming weeks. So to just run through what we're going to do today, we have two wonderful speakers with us. We don't have three. We had three scheduled, and we have wonderfully have Kate and Kristin with us. They will introduce themselves in a moment, and we're going to have a great conversation. And if you have any questions at all, please put them in the chat, and we will get to them either as we go, if it makes sense, or at the end. I'm sure that we'll have time. So without any further ado, I would ask our wonderful presenters to introduce themselves, and in alphabetical order. That starts with Kate.
Hey everybody, my name is Kate Caldwell. I'm a clinical assistant professor in disability and human development at the University of Illinois at Chicago. My background is in disability employment and social policy with expertise in entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship for people with disabilities, including people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We've been doing work, myself and the rest of our core team, Sarah Parker-Harris and Dr. Maya Renko. We've been working with entrepreneurs with disabilities in various capacities for over 10 years now, since 2010, I think. And that includes doing research, trying to establish an evidence base in this area, as well as developing education and training programs. So I'm really excited to share some of the things we've learned with you guys today. And in our work, we found that women with disabilities, in particular, biracial women with disabilities, is one of the largest stakeholder groups when you look at entrepreneurship. A lot of people don't realize that. So I'm super excited to talk about why that's happening and what we can do to support them. And I've already been talking too long, so I'm going to throw it over to Kristin.
Kate, thanks so much. Your enthusiasm is contagious. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having me and inviting me. I think this is such a critical time to be engaging and talking about the disability community. I think when I've seen too many headlines and marquee moments where it's, the missing piece, or, the disability community is maybe left out. I don't think they're missing at all. We're talking about a 1.6 billion, population. So they're not missing, right? They're under-recognized and underserved. And so it's really critical that we're having these conversations. I think now more than ever too, we have an opportunity where we have more listeners, and we're being more empathetic, just as a community globally, based on the past 2 years. And so we can only learn when we listen. So I'm excited to learn today. I'm excited to listen, to participate. And I'm the global director of business diversity at CDW. And so my job really is to ensure that when we are working within procurement and the supply chain, that there is equitable opportunity, not equal opportunity, but equitable. So what does that mean? That when we have entrepreneurs, small businesses that are owned by the disability community, women-owned, minority-owned, veteran-owned, service disabled-owned, that they have opportunities to compete, to win business, because there's no mistake that money matters, right? You have to have revenue to keep your business going. To be a successful entrepreneur, you have to be profitable. So how do we create economic programs that are revenue enabling? So that's the work that I do today. I should also share, I am the mom to a 13-year-old daughter, Caitlin, who has Down syndrome. And so, I think why the disability community is the largest minority globally, it's also the only community that anyone can join at any time. And so I found myself part of the disability community 13 years ago when I was 28 and had a baby girl.
That's a really, I've never heard it quite put that way. I think that's a really interesting aspect of the disability community that a lot of people probably haven't thought of until they're presented with, this is, now I'm a part of this community that I hadn't really thought about. And I wonder, Kate, to draw on something that you had said about your work, of what is it that draws women in a disabled community to look at entrepreneurship, or what draws them into entrepreneurship?
So first and foremost, I thank you so much for sharing your story a little bit there, Kristin. I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. I also want to mention that I also have multiple invisible disabilities, and I was an entrepreneur with a disability. It's part of the reason I'm motivated to do this work and this research. And a lot of times the reason why women with disabilities are drawn to entrepreneurship is the same reason anyone else is drawn to entrepreneurship, right? We've got these push and pull motivations. And the push motivations basically mean you're pushed towards entrepreneurship or self-employment because of a lack of other available options. Whereas pull motivations basically means you're pulled toward out of an interest or a passion, something you want to pursue. And one thing we know looking at the research all around is it's always a combination of push and pull motivations. It's always, and it leads to, like, push motivations usually lead to something called necessity-based entrepreneurship, and pull motivations lead to opportunity-based entrepreneurship. So it's always a balance of needs and opportunities, right? And that has influences for policies, but we can get to that maybe in the future. In terms of the different, there's a distinct difference between disability policy and entrepreneurship policy, and they do not meet. Well, I've already said it. So basically, disability policy is entirely needs-based policies. We don't actually have opportunity-based policies for disabled people, which means entrepreneurs with disabilities don't have access to the same opportunities unless they're looking at the business service system, which is entirely opportunity-based policies, except because they have specific needs, they can't actually access those opportunity-based policies. And so we wind up with a whole bunch of people whose needs are not being met by the current service system. And so they're operating outside the service system. And that's one of the big reasons why we've worked primarily with women with disabilities and in particular people of color, and in particular biracial women with disabilities, because we've been accessing those that are not currently going through vocational rehabilitation, right? They've been turned away from the business and the disability service systems. And we've included inclusion criteria that allows us to talk to them and find out what their experiences have been. And just like with any disadvantaged population, they're doing it for that combination of push and pull factors. They want a job, they need a job, they want to pay taxes, they want to be financially self-sufficient, but also they see a social problem or an unmet need in their community, and they have an idea for how they want to address that. And they want to create a business that will provide for themselves as well as create jobs for others in their community who need it. Right. And that's a large part of why we end up seeing so many disabled people becoming entrepreneurs, but in particular, those experiencing disadvantage encounter more problems and unmet needs and coming up with innovative solutions for how they see that they could address that. Right. And so I think that in a way, that's part of what leads to them turning to self-employment and entrepreneurship. And one thing I also just want to sort of put out there, provide some context for the beginning of this conversation, is when we look at the statistics, at least in the US, people with disabilities are engaging in self-employment at twice the rate of people without disabilities. However, we don't necessarily have data on the success of that business over time. The closest data we have is a little bit outdated, but we know that when it's supported, like supported employment is, their success rate is about the same as job retention rate, which is about 65%. So I'm getting a little bit in the weeds, but that's pretty good. And one of the great things about Canada is y'all leaned into supported entrepreneurship a long time ago, which bodes really well for having an entrepreneurial culture to support entrepreneurs with disabilities in Canada. I'm just gonna leave it there because I know I threw a lot out. Oh, and the pandemic's going to create more interest and more need, because already we have 1.2 million more people with disabilities joining our community.
Yeah, I think that's a really important stat, that it's growing, right, in an accelerated amount. And I think the disability community, you know, taking into account the mental aspect of the past 2 years, right, that it is an accelerated growth that needs to be recognized. And so I really appreciated, you know, your I was able to visualize it, how you said it, right? The needs versus opportunities. You know, I'm such a visual learner, so I was able to like tangibly understand that. When you said there's disability policy, which is needs-based, entrepreneurship, opportunity-based, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? But sometimes they find themselves to be, and then that's an extraordinary barrier to a small business owner. I think that, you know, the small business owners are those that just believe in themselves so much to start their own business, right? To employ other people, to take that responsibility on. Those are the game changers, right? The small business ecosystem, you know, is one that, you know, we saw it collapse and it was catastrophic, right? So we have to do everything we can to make sure it doesn't collapse. But I think to the disability community in the small business sector and entrepreneurship sector, the obstacles are too great, and those that persevere, right, have to really, I think it's extraordinary. So I want to tell you that I loved that you said that, the opportunity based versus, you know, needs based, and how do we make it not mutually exclusive?
And one thing I've been trying to, because I do a lot of work with policymakers and legislators at the federal, state, and local level, and I've been challenging them for years to think about what would opportunity-based disability policy look like.
Yeah.
That's where, because we use policy innovation as sort of rhetoric all the time, but that's what policy innovation would be, right? And that also means, because one of the beautiful things about disability entrepreneurship is that it shifts the paradigm away from seeing disabled people simply as passive employees that need to be hired by someone else, right? And that's where we see the largest amount of employment discrimination, and it's persistent, right? Is in hiring discrimination, discrimination in salary, promotion, and advancement type of work across the board. But now if we're looking at disabled people as job creators, as the person making the hiring decisions, if one disabled business owner hires another employee with a disability, we're not just creating jobs one at a time, we're actually creating exponential growth. And that's also like a big policy shift that needs to be made away from self-employment necessarily, which is a one-on-one basis, towards entrepreneurship, which is actually creating that exponential growth. And that's how entrepreneurship's been used successfully as an anti-poverty strategy, not just an employment strategy, but an anti-poverty strategy in other disadvantaged communities. And it hasn't been used that way in the disability community for some reason. And so in the US, at least, we don't have any entrepreneurship policy. It's just rhetoric. It's just a word we keep saying. All of our policies, self-employment policy. So we're not getting that anti-poverty measure. We're not getting that exponential growth that we could be having. And we're not shifting the paradigm to see people with disabilities as being active in their own social mobility.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead. Sorry, Kristin. So at Women's Enterprise Organizations of Canada, we work with organizations across Canada who support women entrepreneurs. And they do that in either that's their main focus, is they work with entrepreneurs, or it's a program within what they do. And I wonder, what are some, if you have any ideas on ways that those women who are doing business advice and financial advice and working with entrepreneurs on their whole journey of entrepreneurship, and specifically even exporting into some place like the US, what kinds of things can they do to be really maybe adjust how they work with entrepreneurs, or how they're helping them on their journey?
I'm gonna actually recommend Kristin respond, because tapping into her area of expertise is one of the best strategies.
Thanks, Kate. And I want to just applaud that you work across so many organizations, and it really does have to be a community effort. And I don't think it is just a hashtag of being better together. When we are not competing with ourselves, but collaborating, we are moving ahead. So I will answer that. Kate, I wanted to parlay, when you talked about the exponential growth, there's something that I talk about pretty obsessively, if you will, and it's the multiplier effect. And so just to share a little bit, how our work and our passions kind of collide here in a meaningful way. When we're thinking about, procurement, and building supply chains. And I think there's so much conversation in real time right now that the supply chain constraint, the resiliency of the supply chain. If we were to take more in account, the actual people that work in the supply chain, and if they're meaningful wages, I think probably perhaps most underpaid, right? So if we took the human look at what a supply chain is, that our drivers, our stockers, right, making it all happen, and not just the effect of what the supply chain does for the end user, we might be further ahead. But the multiplier effect is something not to be minimized, because when we're talking in procurement and we're saying, okay, CDW or another large organization, where are you going to procure from? Where are you going to, buy your, 3,000 laptops, right, for this session? When we decide to procure with a disability-owned, business, a women-owned business, minority-owned business, and what we're doing is making meaningful commitment to their community, because like Kate said, right, in her example of a disability business owner will most likely hire their community, right? We see that constantly. That's the beautiful thing about community, right? We support each other. So when we are going to procure and make purchases from disability-owned communities, right, we are then helping their families. And so you have to take it a step further, right? So I'll use myself just as an example. I'm pretty sure that I'm going to need a paycheck to send my 2 daughters to college, right? It costs money. There's a tuition payment. And without a paycheck, I might not be able to do that, right? And because I have a paycheck, because I have a job. So when we are investing in small business owners, in entrepreneurs, disability-owned communities, we are then putting more families back to work, more moms and dads back to work, more students in those communities have a chance for higher education, thus then supplier diversity or procurement supply chain, wherever you want to pillar it, then becomes a talent incubator, right? And I think the headlines have been pretty extreme on the lack of diversity in the workforce, right? You can go on LinkedIn and see it in just a second. So now all of a sudden we're looking at supply chains as talent incubators, and we're creating more diverse workforce. And to Kate's point, right, when we can multiply in numbers, right, we can get stronger, they can learn and then be their own entrepreneurs or create their own small businesses, and then be policy makers, and not just not just the ones who have to accept that there is no policy, but those are the game changers, right? And so the multiplier effect is something not to be minimized when we're talking about job creation, meaningful wages. It's more than just where are you procuring, where are you buying? I'm pretty sure most of you, when we were in a lockdown state, I know it happened in my community, there was this big call to action to take out food and do takeout, and everyone's doing all this takeout, right? But that's because you were trying to support your local economy, right? The local economy had to keep going because money matters, right? And so if we can create revenue enabling opportunity in small business ecosystems in the disability community, we then can support higher education talents as well. So I really appreciated that you talked about the exponential growth, because I think it parlays really well into the multiplier effect. I think back to the direct question of what can organizations do? I think there's 2 choices for organizations right now. Either you can be present or you can participate. You can, just be present and join an organization and have your logo, right, part of that organization, and that you're a sponsor of something. But right now, what we need globally is an impact over intent. And so there has to be goals of hiring from our disability community, the women, minority, veteran, whatever we're going to focus on for this purpose. We'll talk through the disability community, but what gets measured, what gets managed gets measured. So we have to set goals, hiring goals, procurement goals, supply chain goals, and follow up on them, right? What is the true impact? What can an organization do? How can we support 2 entrepreneurs this quarter? How can we mentor 2 small business owners from the disability community? Organizations large and small have capacity for mentoring programs, for coaching, for training. So to make a commitment and be measured against it would be, I think, a good first step, right? And I think too, I would say, if you're not in a position, to say we can take on the disability community entrepreneurs, right? We're not going to be able to hold a mentorship protege, then find an organization like yours that does, right? And bring them in. Let's find the SMEs. What I have found, being a mom to Caitlin in the disability community, is the best education I get is from other moms who have kids with Down syndrome. We are our best teachers and students within our community. And so when we can just talk to each other more, learn, understand our journeys, and then be bold enough to share it, right? Because then that's when we build those policy changes. Because if you're not a decision maker today, we have to find out who is making the decisions and get in front of them.
Oh, there's so much here to dig into. And one of the things that you talked about was innovation, and that word's come up, and it can be sort of an empty word of that gets thrown around a lot. But I wonder, and I think throughout this series, we've talked about different groupings of people. And I think what it's all kind of boiled down to in diversity, inclusion, and is that with more voices and more presence and more participation, there's more innovation. And what are you missing out on? And I think in one of our first sessions, one of our panelists said, look at your hiring practices, not from who will fit in with the culture, but who are we missing? Who isn't here? Who is not represented? Who could, and then what could that bring to us from a perspective that we don't have? What perspective are we not hearing because we're not showing them? And too much the culture can be like, well, the culture is people who are like-minded and already agree with us and already look like us and already reflect ourselves back. So I wonder, in terms of looking at supply chain and looking about at entering entrepreneurship, even at the beginning of the stages, what is that innovation? So if you are a company and you're looking at diverse suppliers, what innovation do women entrepreneurs from the disabled community bring that companies can benefit from?
Obviously, I have a response because I unmuted myself, but I also wanted to build off something Kristin said really quickly, and that is because contracting, procurement, and being involved in supplier diversity programs are such a fantastic opportunity for disabled entrepreneurs, but they're not aware of it in many cases. A lot of them don't get certified as disabled women-owned or minority-owned businesses or service disabled and veterans. They aren't aware of those opportunities, or they don't ever have the access to build capacity to successfully compete for and fulfill those contracts. And so that's a huge problem right now that really needs to be addressed, because it is such a great opportunity. It also is, tying back into your question, a great opportunity for idea development and innovation, because they can look at some of these things from a different perspective and have new ideas on it. So when we're talking about, well, what is innovation? It's one of these things that's like a buzzword. People love saying innovation these days, but a lot of times it's not necessarily used correctly. So innovation refers to a new product or service, also new ways of doing things, right? So entrepreneurship within organizations is a great way to find innovation, right? And one that organizations can use pretty effectively if they're, for example, involving their employee resource groups to come up with, solutions in-house, right? And that can lead to entrepreneurship down the road while capacity building, when you may not feel like you otherwise have an opportunity for a distinct mentorship program, right? But the other part of innovation that people usually forget is that it involves a creative, destructive process. Because in order to create something new, it has to replace something that hasn't been working right. And we don't like to do that. We want to innovate, but still hold on to what hasn't quite been working. And so we're kind of like, let's do this and hold on to the old stuff, right? But that's never going to work, because it's always going to hold people back, and it's going to prevent that innovation from being successful, right? So one thing we need to think about when we're innovating is a strategy for phasing out what hasn't been working as part of the innovation process. Otherwise, it's not going to be successful. And I'm now forgetting what your actual question was.
Well, we did have a comment already that I love the definition of innovation, creative, destructive process. And you think that is, I think you could probably like even expand that to the whole world, that people don't like the change and they want to see like, yes, we should be more diverse, but wait, what is that? What do we have to get rid of? How do we have to change our perspective? I don't want to change.
Right.
But I think you should be able to do what you want, but I still want to be able to do what I want. Anyway, my question was just about innovation and when you're looking at diversifying your supply chain or purchasing from minority suppliers, what is the benefit in the innovation and how do you when you're sort of going after business, how do you talk to people about like, this is a good move for you because it's going to pay off in your business. It's not just like a feel good, you get to check a box. There's some actual benefit.
And I'm sure Kristin can speak to this very well, but like disability is over $1 trillion market. And if you actually engage, disabled entrepreneurs, they're going to have a perspective and experience that they're going to be drawing on to help you better tap into that market.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I love this question, and I'll put in the chat in a second. I just didn't want to miss anything, Kate, that you were saying. I'll put in the chat organizations where businesses, entrepreneurs can get certified, right, through Disability In and our global organizations. And if there is any small business owner, entrepreneur, or it's on your roadmap, please reach out to me directly. I'm pretty sure my contact will be released. Happy to help with any certifying opportunity or hurdle, whatever that looks like. It's not easy. I can say that. So we are here to help. We have a whole team at CDW that can assist with certifying because it is important. And it's important because organizations, such as CDW that I work for, when we are building our supply chain, and I work in technology, right, there is such a call to action right now on clean tech and sustainable supply chains. And so clean tech is more than just a net zero commitment. When we're looking at clean tech overall in the supply chain, it's who are they hiring? What are their hiring practices? What does the workforce look like? And where do they source from? And then who do they sub from, right? To matrix that all out is huge responsibility. But when a small business or a diverse supplier can get a certification, disability owned, that means that a third party, right, created an audit, assessed their opportunity, assessed their if it's technology, assessed where they're sourcing from, assessed a workforce, workplace, and supply chain. And so that gives more validity, right, to an organization, right, public and private sector. We can have the certification. I think too, to be brass tacks about things, there are organizations, there's one called the $1 Billion Roundtable, and it's a global organization, procurement organization. It's been around 20 years, and there's only 28 global companies today, or in 20 years, that have been inducted into what's called the $1 Billion Roundtable. And what the $1 Billion Roundtable means is that each of those organizations have spent $1 billion directly with a diverse supply chain, a certified diverse supply chain. And so for an organization to be in the BDR and have that regard, they have to do business with certified organizations. So, right, again, to be transparent, if I'm working towards our BDR roadmap at CDW to ensure, right, we exceed our $1 billion commitment in the supply chain, they have to be certified, right? So there's advantages that way. But once you're part of those organizations, right, like yours or Disability In, or there's so many great organizations right now. Once you're part of it and you have that membership community, you are getting resources, you're tapping into matchmaking opportunities. We're invited to matchmaking constantly with small business and entrepreneurs. And I think one of the good things, so I think there are still things to celebrate over the past 2 years. We may have to hunt for them, but there are things to celebrate. What I do think is that in this digitalized environment, it became an equalizer, for the disability community. If we're going to, stay here, it was a differentiator, because before, when you were maybe going to come work at or create an opportunity to have a meeting with the public or private sector, you could, go to a restaurant or wine and dine or invite them onto your campus and show them around. Well, maybe the small business owner didn't have those things, but today we all get the same Zoom link. We all Zoom in. So it is really on value, right? Cost, experience, differentiation. And so I think this is such a great differentiator that the small business ecosystem can tap into. And I've seen great success stories, right, at CDW where historically, maybe prior to 2 years, we would have been invited to this very great dinner, a 3-day event. We would, go boating and then, pitch this opportunity to take on this new technology or whatnot. But now we all Zoom in. And I've seen, an increase in our spend with the diverse supply chain. So last year, CDW, we spent $3.4 billion with the diverse supply chain, an organizational high, and all of those were certified. So Kate, to your point. What I think too, to answer the direct question, what is the advantage, right? Or what are we learning? When we are tapping into minority groups, right? One, we're paying attention and we are learning, what is a hurdle today? What's an obstacle? We're all in an environment, I think, in a place right now where we want to be solution providers, right? How do we stand in the gap? I was raised to stand in the gap. I raised my 2 daughters to stand in the gap. And I think there are more people right now wanting to stand in the gap. And so when we can engage the disability community, entrepreneurs, small businesses, and stand in the gap and see what is a hurdle, bring them into our supply chain, get to know them, instead of just offering a one-size-fits-all mentorship program, customize it, right? That's standing in the gap. That's bringing legacy work to a transformative approach. And I think that's the best thing that I love working with the diverse supply chain. At CDW, it's about 2,000 suppliers that are in our chain today. And so it's collaboration, it's standing in the gap, and it's being able to participate, not just present.
And if I can respond, I really love how you phrased that. And it sort of made me also think about why this work is so important. And like in the work that we've done with entrepreneurs with disabilities, we see so many people with good ideas, right? That don't necessarily get it to be successful businesses. And a large part of the reason why is because they have difficulty bridging that benefits gap. And a large part is because they don't have access to opportunities or membership in those networks that would really help them grow and sustain their business over time. So we see people instead that are trying to they're specifically limiting their business. They're keeping it small, even though it's successful. It's when they start to get too successful and they reach a point where they're worried it's going to compromise their benefits and they might lose their benefits, their health care. And so they stop their business growth before it gets too successful. And then they sort of think that they're going to be able to sustain their business when they keep limiting its growth. And that's never going to work. And all it does is maintain their reliance upon the public benefit system and prevent them from ever being able to bridge that gap. And so from a policy perspective and a programming perspective, the question is always, how do we help entrepreneurs with disabilities, especially those with innovative and good ideas that are working, bridge that gap and actually grow their business over time, and so that they can hire those employees, so that they can make this impact and make these differences.
You made me think of, Kate, I agreed with everything because it's so undervalued and so undertapped, right? It really is. And I see so many incubator programs, startup programs, and the disability community is that missing piece, right? But they're not missing at all. They're just not being invited. And so it's days like this where we are, putting a call to action to include and invite, because I think economic recovery will be fueled by inclusion. If there's anything that we haven't learned. But, you made me think of, those small businesses that don't get to go to the next level, right? Or the disability owned entrepreneurs that maybe, that have these limits, maybe based upon themselves or right, not sure where to go or whatnot. But I think that if we take a step back, and this might be too, over personal, but I'm really focused, for my family, for Caitlin, on her generational peers today. Because when I talk through how important it is at school and her IEP and all the hurdles and the joys that comes with, each month in each grade level, I fiercely focus and applied focus on what is the interaction with her peers. Because to your point, Kate, how I'm going to connect it, those will be her hiring managers. Those will be the peers potentially that create a startup program or that work for a global 500 organization, and then they lead the incubator program, right, that's going to launch. And so, what is that peer environment? So I think it has to start. So anyone who's listening either today or, in a recorded session, to think about, our students today and what inclusive opportunities do they have, because they will be the business decision makers in 15 years time. So to be patient, yes, but to create opportunities of inclusion now, so that when we have somebody in 10 years running, this global startup program, that they remember, oh yeah, where's the disability community? I remember Caitlin Malek. She was awesome, right? We had math together, and it's not the first time they're being exposed to the disability community when they're in the business setting. So we have to look for opportunities in current time with our students. So it made me think of that, of how important it is not to focus on it when you are a decision maker, but when you're a member of the community.
And
I really, sorry.
I'm so sorry.
No.
I'm just enjoying this conversation so much. I just wanted to say, I love that. And we could go even a step further, which I think it was kind of what you were saying, which is having that expectation of inclusion from the get-go, from young ages, right?
Yeah, I agree. Sorry, go ahead. I don't want you to...
No, I just think this is the most, I don't know why this resonates with me so much, but I also have two daughters, and I was just talking to one of them about diversity in her classroom, and that when she was really little, she went to a very diverse daycare with lots of just all kinds of diversity, and now in her school there's not very much, and she was talking about that, about like recognizing it and seeing it, and like, why is that, and all of the things. And I think to think about like that, this generation, if you're looking at teenagers now, what are they in 15 years? It's as a parent, sometimes you're like, 15 years, I can't even imagine this is a full human in 15 years. Not that they're not fully human now, but they're real life out on their own in the world in 15 years. It matters now, and it's so interesting. And so one question that we did have come to me directly was about mentorship, and in all of these different conversations that we've been having, this has come up again and again, and it's so important for entrepreneurs, and something that you had mentioned, Kristin, that kind of builds off this whole conversation is about finding other mothers who with children with Down syndrome, who you were like, yes, we get each other, we have the same conversation, we can move forward. So what are and not having being able not invited in sort of into the conversation. So how do you, and how do I say this, from a business advisor or a perspective, when you have a woman and you're saying like, well, you need to be part of a community, or maybe you could find some peers or find mentorships. That sounds so easy, but that is a really, really hard thing to do. And it is very, where on earth do you start? So I guess I would just love both of your perspectives on how do you encourage people to find that community? Where can you look, and what kind of benefit does that bring for an entrepreneur?
This is one of the areas that we address in our research, as well as in the training that we've developed. So one of the things that we found in our research is that entrepreneurs with disabilities need both business mentors and sort of disability entrepreneurship mentors. So, business mentors that don't necessarily have disabilities themselves are going to be useful, but also, entrepreneurs with disabilities, those that have succeeded as well as those that have failed, have important lessons and also really help to build that sense of community. But in terms of strategies for finding a mentor, one of the things that we recommend is to really do a self-assessment of your skills. and those skills where you have strengths and weaknesses. So kind of a SWOT analysis, right? And then to think about those areas that you want to strengthen, and to specifically look for people that you admire for those skill areas, and to reach out to them specifically to work on strengthening those specific areas where you want to build those strengths. That's a really great way to approach mentors, because you also automatically have a place to start from and a conversation to start. And then in terms of finding community, it might be less a mentor, like a traditional mentorship kind of approach, but more sort of building community of those who are in the struggle with you, right? Who are also, you know, starting and succeeding or failing in their businesses. And a lot of that community building we found just through our training sessions. And also we had a focus group session, I'm not gonna lie. So we're researchers, it's gonna be anonymous and confidential. We won't share any information about just you. And they were just like, so could we get everybody's email addresses and phone numbers? Because we want to stay in contact after the session. And we're just like, well, we can't collect that information, but if you guys want to do it, we'll leave the room and you guys can like share information. And they did. And they're still in contact with each other today. You know, so I think that's going to happen in any space that's created for disabled entrepreneurs. It's just a lot of folks don't have those spaces, whether or not it's appropriate.
You know, that's a funny story. You're like, oh gosh, we'll leave the room while you do that. I'm one of those people though, you would have probably given a look to me because I'm like, can I have your number? I'm just like a connector at heart. Like, can we stay in touch? Are you on LinkedIn? So I would have been one of those people in your session, Kate. You know, I think, you know, if I were to tail this back, you know, when I became a new mom to Caitlin, how did I find my community? You know, I didn't go looking for it. I actually kind of pushed against it, but I realized I needed it. And here's why. After I had Caitlin, when I walked around stores, right, pushing my new stroller, I would go to, you know, a baby store or the grocery store, went out to dinner. I didn't see somebody with Down syndrome for like months. I was in my mind, I'm like, where are they? Like, do they work? Do they go to school? I couldn't really think of anybody with Down syndrome in my mind. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, life goes on. Did Corky have Down syndrome? Like, these are like real thoughts in my mind where I'm trying to rationalize, you know, what was happening. And so when I shopped and I dined and even on TV, I didn't see anybody with Down syndrome for months. And that became really isolating. And, you know, I kind of put myself on this island and I thought, okay, I'm just going to do this myself. I'm going to learn. And I read all the books, did all the things, right? Of Babies Down Syndrome 101 and Bloom, and was on Google too much. And then I came upon an organization, the Down Syndrome Achievement Center. And there was like an open play or come meet on a Thursday. And so I drove there. And I was in the parking lot for probably 10 minutes and finally went in. And when I went in, there were so many kids with Down syndrome and so many moms. And that was life-changing for me because it was the first time I had seen somebody that looked like Caitlin. And, you know, so I just am a huge advocate of being patient and seeking out your community because it really made a huge difference for me. It really created, I call that moment, really was a bridge, right? I was definitely on an island. There's no doubt. If you talk to any of my family or friends 13 years ago, I was definitely on an island. But that community was a bridge. And then together we built steps, you know, so I could feel like a part of the community. But, you know, that's not easy. That wasn't easy to do. That's not really easy to talk about. But I think, you know, as you're looking for membership or community, it's okay to try them out. You know, if it's not working or not serving you, then move on. Sometimes I think women, we kind of like stick it out, or we're like, we don't want to say no, but if it's not working, move on and ask the questions, you know, what can I gain? What can I give? Right? Because we're givers too, right? Givers of time, we're forgivers, we're givers of knowledge, givers of our mind share always. And so what can you give? and what can you learn are questions to ask, but to find one that works, but don't stick it out if it's not working. If there's any good lesson to you, right? Health is wealth and time is our most, critical asset. Those are definitely my two learnings from the past 2 years. Health is wealth and time is very valuable.
Thank you for sharing with us, Kristin. I think I'm positive it will resonate, your story will resonate with so many people. And I think that, it reminds me of something that you touched on earlier, which was the digitization of being an equalizer. And I think about finding community through social media, which wasn't an option, and that you can kind of build a community that way. But I also think, and part of it is where we physically are in our country and in the middle of it, that we're pretty far from an event that's going to happen on the East Coast or on the West Coast, and travel is difficult for entrepreneurs who don't have a lot of funds for travel. Travel is exponentially more difficult if you are a caregiver for somebody, exponentially more difficult if you have physical challenges or mental challenges for traveling, and all of that brings with it. So how do we, as we are sort of looking at the opening up and the returning to more in-person events and in-person meetings, and how do we keep that going where there is that inclusion that came in some ways from the ability to meet and connect digitally and have access that you might not have had? For disabled entrepreneurs, what are some ways that we can keep that going? Or maybe even not from their perspective, because it's not their problem to solve, it's our problem to solve. So how do we be mindful in looking forward of how we're connecting?
And that's a really wonderful question. And I think we need to start with a caveat that in all of the ways that the switch to working virtually has benefited many people with disabilities, we still have some significant access problems when it comes to web technology that should have been addressed a while ago and have not. And so there are some people that have continued to struggle or who might have been facing increased access barriers because of the switch to virtual environments. That includes blind and low vision users, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in different capacities, right? That said, we know that social media has been a very powerful tool for the disability community and to help them connect despite those technological access barriers, right? And one of the biggest concerns that we're hearing from the disability community right now, especially on social media, is concerns about employers and colleagues in this return to work when we have so many who are high risk and immunocompromised and who cannot safely return to work. They're really worried about their access being taken away from them by not having equitable access, or in some cases concerned about having even less access, as we've seen the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act here in the US, coming under fire. That's our primary civil rights legislation for people with disabilities, and it keeps coming under fire in Congress to try and weaken the Title III for public accommodations, which would significantly make it a barrier for disabled entrepreneurs to do their jobs, right? To be able to talk to contractors and distributors and go even banks and everything that they're going to need to do their jobs. And ironically, one of the arguments that was used when this first passed in the House was a story that may or may not be true about a disabled business owner in Texas who said that the ADA was harming his business because it was costing him too much to make his business accessible. I don't know. I haven't heard stories like that. What I can tell you is our research has found disabled business owners rely upon the ADA in order to do their business, and not having those anti-discrimination protections would make it very difficult, right? So I think when we talk about this technology issue, we need to recognize that there's still technology barriers that never were successfully met And as we return to in person, we need to make sure that people aren't being left behind. And we've innovated, right? We've created new ways of doing things where we've made things available virtually that weren't available before. And and for some reason, people want to phase those out. And we're phasing out the wrong part. The creative destructive process isn't supposed to phase out the innovation, right? So that's just my 2 cents.
No, Kate, you're much more eloquent than what I think I would share. I wrote down what you were saying, but here's a few things that came to my mind. Is I do think it's a concern that we should be talking about more. I think a few things come to my mind that we are talking a lot about what we've been through, and I think there could be more conversation on what re-entry looks like. What is it going to feel like when things do open up, or when you can travel, when you are going back to the workplace, right? What does re-entry mean? It means, to so many things to so many different people. What resources are there? What can workplaces do? But the re-entry of all of this, not having to wear a mask to wearing a mask for 2 years, that's more than a hashtag, right? That's real life. That's real practice. So I just think being compassionate and asking, what does re-entry look like? Do you want to talk about re-entry? I think we can still probably talk about what we've been through and how hard the 2 years have been. I'll engage and be, present for that, but I will always ask, like, what does re-entry look like? How are you feeling? For teachers, public, private sector, students, me going back into the office, right? All of it. We all have to acknowledge what re-entry looks like. I do think the disability community has a huge risk of being left behind here. So I think this is where I wrote down allyship. I have to reflect a little bit. 2 years ago, Commissioner Victor Calise in New York City, he appointed me to the COVID task force he runs the office for people with disabilities in New York City. And so the things that we were solving for, we had people in the disability community in New York City not getting their services because they weren't signing a waiver to let a healthcare worker come in. Well, if you don't have a working limb to hit print, then you won't be able to sign the waiver. So we were solving for things like that. And, I think when I looked at my role in that task force, allyship. So we have to be aware of who is missing. Let's reach out to them. If you're not comfortable, then maybe your boss or a friend or whoever, like, who's not here right now? Who didn't make it to this work event? Who didn't make it to this event? But look around and see who's participating and who's not and who's showing up, and make a call out because maybe they didn't open the email. It wasn't able to be clicked open, right? Or the screen was not, something that worked for their vision impairment, but to ask why. But allyship is activity, right? It's much more than saying I'm an ally. We need more allies to the disability community. We need people looking and watching, right? And so that would be my 2 cents, but I do think that it's a risk to leave behind. Absolutely.
That actually makes me think, Kristin, I can bring this full circle back to the first question that you asked, which is, why women entrepreneurs, right? And it's that question, right? Who's at the table? So if you look historically at all the research that had been done prior to what we started doing on disability entrepreneurship, which was actually self-employment, that's a question for another day, but it's all with white men, middle-aged white men with physical disabilities. That's all it was. And so everyone's like, well, those are the ones who are most using entrepreneurship or self-employment. That's not the case. Those are the ones who are successful using VR, because women and people of color are being turned away from VR. That's another project that we're working on that we're going to be having some really great research on coming up soon. But they're being turned away from VR, and they're being told, like, there's articles that say, oh, well, women just want poor quality work outcomes. They don't want to work full time, and they don't want to be paid better. So that's why men have better job outcomes. Same with people of color. They don't want better jobs, or they aren't living in the right areas for them, right? And so it is really the who's at the table and who's actually being turned away from VR, as well as small business development services. Because that's what we found when we started talking to this group of entrepreneurs with disabilities that was operating outside of both of those service systems, is they went to VR and they were told that they weren't a good candidate. They didn't believe that they were going to be successful in starting a business. It was entirely subjective, right? Whereas they're much more likely to believe that a middle-aged white man with physical disabilities is going to be successful in starting a business. So they're actually going to offer it to him. They're not offering it to other people. We looked at a government accountability report for how many people, how many employment network agencies are actually offering entrepreneurship. It's less than 14% across the entire country are even offering it as an option. And then when they go to, when disabled people, disabled women of color in particular, go to small business development centers, a lot of times they might not be able to get in because there might be a step. They might not have an interpreter. They might not have accessible materials. Their website might not be, to make an appointment might not be accessible, right? So getting their foot in the door, so to speak, is difficult. But even when they do, and we've talked to small business development centers, we've interviewed them as well. And usually they say, well, if someone's on benefits, then we can't work with them. And that's not true at all. But then their next response is, well, we haven't had enough disabled people come in to necessitate us providing accommodations for them. It's like, well, they can't come in because you don't have the accommodations. If you had the accommodations, they'd be coming in, right? So it literally is about them getting a seat at the table because they aren't being counted right now. So that, we say more than twice as many disabled people are interested in self-employment. It's probably higher. It's probably markedly higher.
And it's so interesting, and I had another comment come to me through the chat of just reminding me that there are a lot of technological access is not equal. Not only having access to working technology and internet, which is a definite issue in areas of Canada, but is also all of the technology does not work for you. I have tried definitely to use voice activated, which is just a tiny little thing, and that doesn't work. And so I think that idea of looking around the table and saying, well, who isn't here and why not? And is there a solvable solution that I can make in my everyday practice of saying, like, I'm an advisor to women entrepreneurs, but now that I think about it, I haven't had a disabled woman come to my organization in my time in this last 2 years. Well, why not? What's been the thing? And it's not a difficult process, I would think, to try to look at what might be the barriers that I haven't even recognized that are just something I can solve. So I think that's a really meaningful takeaway to me. We are we're at 1 o'clock, so we're on my time at the hour. So I thank you both so much for being here today. And I know that that we are going to share this recording and that we're going to have lots of people looking at it and discussing it. We've included everything in the chat about how to contact both of you and find out more about your work. And we'll be sending out resources after the fact in both Spanish, French, and English. And again, just thank you so much. I was thrilled that both of you could join us today and took a lot away from the conversation. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to share time.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful meeting you all and being able to talk with you. And merci, French. And I feel like, Kristin, we're going to have to meet up and hang out at some point when it's safe to do so.
Yeah, I would love for us all to get together. Thank you so much. And please reach out. I'm glad all the contacts being shared. So thank you very much.